And I think my conclusion was that actually people who are really in a transition often don't self-identify well. And I've done a lot of really interesting things, worked with a lot of great people, but I definitely reached a point where it was less fun, interesting, and engaging than it had once been.
This is Intentionally Ever After. Join intentional lifestyle coach Joe Bukartek for a series of personal conversations and coaching sessions with various people about how living with intention shows up for them.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome back. Today, I'm very excited to talk to my good friend and fellow coach, Paul Gaskell. Paul, welcome.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, Paul, will you kindly introduce yourself to folks?
Sure. So is this the LinkedIn introduction, or is this the...
This is the non-LinkedIn. Who is Paul beyond LinkedIn?
Well, so it sounds a bit corny, but I've kind of worked on my Twitter intro for several years. That's probably as good as any.
Ooh, I actually, as someone who's a novice to Twitter, what does that even mean?
So basically, I think you've got probably 128 characters. I have no idea. Some small number of things you can describe yourself as.
A limited number.
And I think mine says something like husband, father, coach, lover of ideas, music, and my football team winning. That would be soccer team to people on this side of the Atlantic.
Thank you for translating that. Yeah. Well, that sounds pretty good. Which one of those roles are you feeling most pertinent to you, or most salient maybe lately? So I guess with the amount of time we spent at home as a family, it feels somewhere between the husband and father piece. So it feels like we've had an exposure to, particularly the kids are at school, they're schooling in a way that would never have happened in kind of normal times. And there's good and bad to it. I think the good is that it feels like you're kind of more able to help them. The bad is I don't know that you really can anymore, and you kind of probably creates more anxiety around where you can't help them. So, right. Where do you feel like you can't help them? Is it the education subject matter, or is it just the life of a child?
I think for our kids, particularly they're both teenagers, it's about kind of time management. So it's interesting because it's the kind of things that may well end up talking to a client about on any given day, about how to kind of use your time most effectively, except they're not generally asking the questions. They're just usually stuck in a place where, it's obvious that managing their time is challenging.
Right. And are they actually seeking help out as a client might?
Short version's no. Occasionally, opportunities present themselves.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, if I can ask you, this is something that comes up for me quite a bit, and I'm wondering, how do you know when to put on your coaching cap at home, as far as, the curious inquiry or the, this is how I feel, damn it.
You're asking me that question like I know the answer, right?
No, I'm just curious how you deal with it.
So, in the back of my head is something my son said to me probably like 3 or 4 years ago, where I was suggesting something to him about how he might approach something. And he said something like, Dad, enough with the coaching. So that's burned into my...
Mm-hmm.
So I will try. Actually, where it applies most is, so my wife, Rachel, really wants to kind of be more proactive in terms of helping the kids and kind of creating the schedules for them. So actually where it shows up most is me trying to suggest ways to kind of have that effect without so much tell. So in my worst moments, I will end up telling them what I think they should do when they're not receptive to it. But I really try to look for the moments when, maybe they're struggling with something and like, hey, would an idea or two help here? Or, here's what I've seen work for other people.
Yeah, that's. So you say you made that brief comment in your worst moment. You'll actually tell them where. So is the ideal that you are able to stay in coach mindset for these interactions?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, I think they're, in many ways, they're a bit like, and I don't know if you've experienced this, where someone has hired you to be someone's coach, and they're not necessarily 100% invested in the notion, but they've been told that this is going to be good for you. It feels a bit like that, in that it's like, well, somebody says this might be good for me, but I'm not sure I'm buying into anything I'm getting from this.
I think that's huge. Yeah, I think they have not bought into the coaching relationship.
Yes, they certainly haven't signed a contract. Yeah, that's for sure.
Right, right. And certainly for me, I've been a husband longer than I've been a coach. I've been a father longer than I've been a coach.
Yeah.
And neither one of these two individuals that I'm referring to hired me to be their coach. Or so there are times, certainly. And I have the benefit / detriment of the fact that my wife has coaching education as well. So she's very readily able to call me out on when I'm coaching, even with my best intentions. You know,
that sounds like a bit of a nightmare, actually. But
it can be a nightmare or constant opportunity to reflect on how I want to show up differently. That's how I've chosen to view it.
That's good. That's good. I like it.
Yeah. So, Paul, what does it mean to you to live intentionally?
I've been thinking about this a couple of different ways, actually, because I've been doing some work with clients recently about habits. And the one thing that I'm conscious of is how difficult it is to use willpower as a way to change habits. So I think there's something about intentional being something that you're trying to do, or trying to do in a way that makes it kind of more automatic that you are doing it. So I think I gave you the example when we talked about this previously of the one thing that's really helped my coaching, I think, actually, is kind of embracing the notion that Zoom offers at least as much opportunity to connect with somebody as kind of being in person, in that you can kind of really focus on the moment with Zoom. So that's something that I've really set out to do in an intentional way. But I think the only way it works is, rather than me sit here on every Zoom call thinking, let's make this intentionally focused and be strong, is to kind of find a groove where that happens in more of a kind of an automatic way. So it's become a habit, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So how do you build that habit?
I think there's a few different ways. And I think that I've read a lot of books about habits. And I think one of the things is that I think you have to find your own way of dealing with embedding habits. So I'm always taken back to that book. Is Getting Things Done? David Allen book, where he's got this great advice for people who think the way he thinks, and I don't think the way he thinks. So a lot of his sort of his advice about doing a mind sweep, or which is not terrible, and then putting things all in these files is really draining for me to do on a regular basis.
Yeah.
So I have to find a slightly different way around it. So certainly, if I just think about the Zoom habit, what has made it work is to try and introduce different things to kind of make the environment feel more kind of welcoming. So I don't know about you, but during the pandemic, I've changed my chair. I bought one of those glass platforms that goes underneath my chair, which allows the chair to move around more. And it just, again, feels more kind of grounding. So therefore, there's less little irritating things like the chair won't move properly, or I don't like the feel of the carpet under my feet kind of thing. So that there's less things that can be distracting.
So you're referring to changes to your physical environment to make them more accommodating?
Yeah. I think it's about taking away some of the distractions, actually, if I think about it. Again, one of the things that makes that whole filing thing that David Allen talks about so hard for me is it just seems such a low energy activity compared to other stuff I could be doing, whatever that is.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think common to most, you hear these wonderful ideas that other people have, they've put in books, they've spun it any number of ways, their messages, and you're like, oh, that sounds good. But I don't know, it doesn't really speak to me. Do you think living intentionally is a unique personal experience, or is it something that can be broadly approached?
My answer is it depends. So in my coaching, I generally come from a place of let me understand kind of who you are and what your strengths are, and then let's sort of figure out solutions. So I think one person's, so I've coached people who see some challenges as just, I just need to set myself that goal and I can kind of work towards it, because the goal is kind of, creates all the intention I need. I've worked with other people for whom they have goals and they're really hard to accomplish for lots of complicated reasons, which can kind of go back, kind of a long time in their sort of psyche. And for them, it's harder to be intentional because there's things they can't obviously see. I was doing some work with someone on Friday, and we kind of got to a place where they sort of started remembering some things about themselves that made it really hard to kind of follow through on a goal that they've had for months, if not years. So I think the intentionality, the short version of it is, depends on the person and kind of depends on what it is that they're trying to accomplish and how heavily that weighs against other things that they may or may not be conscious of.
Yeah. Well, it has me immediately thinking, what would this person have done if they had not been working with you? Would they notice this thing?
Well, so part of me wants to say they could have got there, but I know that you kind of, one of the things we talked about before recording is, I think you probably asked me a question of some version of this later, but what does, something that looks really good on a kind of daily basis look like? It, and it's where someone says, I couldn't have got there without you. And I'm not sure that, it's interesting, I'm not sure I ever believe that's quite true, because I kind of think there's bound to be someone else who could help you get there, because there's kind of techniques and approaches you can use and other people could be using them. So I guess I should be kinder to myself and say, well, in that moment, I was the fortunate person able to be there to help them see that.
You are very humble, sir. Yeah. So I will give you credit for it. So sure, right. The coaching process, there are tools, there are ways to inquire and drag this out of people in some cases. But not everyone has those abilities, right? And you at some point had established the trust with this individual that they were willing to open up knowingly or unknowingly and able to uncover this boundary. So I'm giving you full marks on that one, Paul.
Wow, thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. So how about you yourself? What is one change in habit that has had an exponential payoff for you?
Yeah. So it was strange. It took me back to when I was probably in my teens. There's a couple of different answers to this, because I do think the kind of, during the pandemic, came across a lot of people for whom all sorts of things were just irritating. They couldn't wait, quotes, to get back to normal. It must have been the hardest year for those folks in trying to navigate, because it was kind of all bad and it was all sort of, things were on hold, as opposed to how can I at least embrace this and figure out some things to do and things to work through.
Right.
So I think that's kind of one answer in terms of a change in habit. But I think where that comes from is something that I did in my teens. I remember making this conscious thought to where if I was going to do something or I was going to help somebody, then I needed to feel positive about it. And I can't even remember what instigated this, but I do have a strong memory of changing my mind about, and it may have been something as trivial as, I don't know, helping out a home or something, but saying to myself, well, if you're not going to feel grateful or thankful or happy about doing it, then it's going to constantly be kind of annoying and negative. And I've tried along the way to feel as positive as I can about the things that I get asked to do, because that I think has been really helpful in a lot of different situations to get through things that may on the face of it not look that fun or not look that interesting or really wasn't committed to.
Yeah, that's of course I'm dying to know, back to when it first showed up and where that might have come from. How about a recent example of where that's proven to be true? Maybe it's not even front of mind because it's such a habit now. What's a recent example of showing up and really getting into it because it's worth doing? It's worth showing up fully for.
Yeah. I'm struggling to think of a sort of a confined example, but let me go with this. I belong to a few different communities, and I'm on kind of committees associated with school and a couple of other different things. And I think one of the things at the very beginning I saw with some of the kind of committee members was a kind of resignation that, well, we can't do anything now because nobody can meet, and all of the events that we planned are not going to make sense. And I think one of the things that I kind of tried to do, especially at the beginning, was try and find ways, whether it was kind of virtually or whether it was just kind of through chat groups, to kind of keep some of the communities kind of going just by kind of sharing information or kind of even doing some virtual events. And I think that's probably it's not a fantastic example, but I think it's a good example of trying to look at things in a positive way rather than kind of treat them as, well, it's all bad and there's no good is going to come of anything we're going to do, which sort of felt like what I was hearing from a couple of other people who were on those same committees.
For sure. There's been a trend of defeatist attitude, if you will. Excuse me, in particular from last year, and understandably so, right? A lot of people have the vast amount of uncertainty that we all face, but it sounds like you've taken this habit and kind of injected it to positively affect others in the various communities that you're a part of. So I'd say that's a great example.
Yeah.
Can't imagine it's always easy to do.
Right. So why I was hesitating with the example is, I didn't mention this yet, but so I'm the president of the Liverpool Football Club supporters in Delaware, the official supporters club group, and we did a lot of virtual events at the beginning because essentially sport stopped, so there wasn't even something to kind of rally around in terms of games at the very beginning of the pandemic, and we got probably maybe 15. Maybe 20 people to some of the events at the very beginning. And it wasn't long, though, probably a couple of months in, before we'd at most get 5 or 6 people showing up to events. There was some appetite for it at the very beginning, but it seemed clear that whether it was of value to everybody, I'm not sure, but the sort of interest in it definitely waned.
You think it was the interest level or external factors? I guess that's what I think, which is why I'm asking it in that way.
Yeah. It's probably a combination of things, actually. If your interaction with a group, which it is usually watching a game together, that's really hard to replicate when there's no game and you're not together, right? So you can kind of create some things, but I think in the end it was like, well, that's kind of interesting, but I'm not sure we're up for it. I think at the beginning, like we had, I think 2 events a week scheduled, and then gradually, which I think we concluded, that's too many. We don't need that. But then when we kind of went to 1 every 2 weeks, the attendance got down to 5. So, I suspect it would have gone the same direction had we kept up the number of events. But yeah, I also think once we got to summer, people found other things to do, and we haven't typically done many events in the last 3-4 months, but when we have, we've not had a big take up. So I wonder if other people, I suspect other people have found their own kind of patterns of things to do, and this wasn't the most important thing for them at this point.
So they likely replaced it with something as opposed to chosen to do nothing.
Yeah, I would guess so. Yeah. I mean, I think there was so much influx at the beginning. If people invited you to a Zoom happy hour or something, then it seemed kind of, I've got nothing else to do, so why not go? Right.
It seemed quaint and novel at that time until we were jumping on Zoom for every little thing. Right. And I think, that started to wear on some folks. Zoom fatigue, right? That became a term.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
And I think, there's different levels of that. I think some people from the beginning decided that this was awful, and why did they have to, it's like, this is kind of taken over my life. And I think it's much easier to have Zoom fatigue if you start from that perspective, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
What have you said no to that has made a significant impact in your life?
I think one thing that probably made a big difference in terms of saying no was when I left the corporate world, what's now 7 years ago. There were opportunities to stay and do some other work, but I decided it was the right time to make a break. I'd worked for AstraZeneca for over 20 years, and I'd done a lot of really interesting things, worked with a lot of great people, but I definitely reached a point where it was less fun, interesting, and engaging than it had once been. So I think the decision to walk away was really saying, no, I'm going to kind of take a risk and leave corporate and try to do something by myself, which eventually turned into coaching with my own business. But kind of when I made the decision to say, no, I don't want another sort of role doing something that I feel like I've already done, and maybe not in as kind of welcoming an environment, that felt pretty crucial.
Sounds like there was a certain leap of faith that was required for you to do so.
Yeah. I mean, so some of it was to do with the company. So when I kind of decided that, part of me was thinking I may try and do some of the change management stuff elsewhere in another organization, because I sort of reached the point where I think I'd become a bit jaded by the environment that we were in. So even though I was doing change management, we were kind of making changes, which I wasn't always convinced about. In fact, for a while, it seemed like we had a pattern where our VP would lead some change. Well, he'd have someone lead some change, and then shortly after it proved not to be that successful, he would leave, and then another VP would show up, and again, we'd repeat the pattern. So, but it was a later decision to decide that I wasn't going to go look for another role like that in corporate and do kind of break out and do coaching on my own.
Well, that's interesting to me, because in a lot of conversations that I've had with folks over the years, the later someone is into a career, typically the more difficult it is for them to pivot or to break off entirely. So that's interesting that you're kind of, it sounds like you're presenting it as, well, I didn't decide until much later to do this. Yeah. That sounds like it's pretty noteworthy.
So it was definitely a pivot, because where I started was in the IT department, was an executive in the global IT organization within AstraZeneca. And we ended up doing so much change, which seemed much more interesting to me than some of the kind of technology stuff, although many of the technology things drove change as well. So the two weren't completely divorced. So I worked on change management projects pretty much for about my last 5 years at AstraZeneca. So in some senses, I'd made a bit of a pivot already from kind of a sort of notionally a technology person, which I never really don't. I don't know. I think the last time I did anything that might be seriously regarded as technology was like back in the dim and distant past. But to change management, and my realization in doing change management was how important it was to coach leaders through changes, because typically people were given changes to run, and they might be given a book or told to read some work by, I don't know, John Cotter, for example, and then get on with it. Whereas the most powerful thing that I found was, in my world at that point, my version of coaching leaders to help them understand kind of best practice and things that they could do to kind of make almost subtle things they could do to make the change more impactful and more successful was huge. So I started doing kind of more and more of that, and finally persuaded my boss at the time to send me on coach training, which was, I think, 2012, where I discovered that what I described as coaching in the change context, it really was more consulting than it was coaching. But nevertheless, it set me on a path,
sure,
which So there's definitely some pivot sounds like a kind of a one movement. It kind of felt like more of an arc, right, from kind of one career to another. I'm making, which is not going to show up on audio, right? But yeah.
That's true. I think everyone can visualize that. Yeah. Yeah. A smooth arc. What's the angle of that arc exactly? So they can picture it even better.
Oh, I think it sort of, I don't know. The way I've drawn it, it feels like it's going up and then crashing to the ground. But
right. It's coasting gently, I think, is more appropriate.
Yes. It's a different direction.
Yeah. So what area in your life feels just about perfect?
So I think I'd mentioned, I've kind of touched on this before, but I do think those moments where clients will say things like, I couldn't have got here without you, or your help was absolutely key. And it's funny, sometimes those moments are kind of hard to spot. And what I've found as I've sort of got more experience is to kind of really get people to think about. So again, I was with somebody else last week, and they shared something with me about kind of why they were finding it difficult to complete a particular set of tasks. And they used an image to describe it. And I won't share the image because that will give it away to the person who I was coaching if they're listening to this. Sure. I could have kind of like, oh, that's really interesting. But I chose to explore sort of why they were using that image, and what it became clear through the conversation was this was a realization that they'd actually never had before. Now, it came really easily in the moment, but it wasn't something that they, I think, been very aware of. And that was just a kind of wonderful moment. And I am fully expecting when we meet again in a couple of weeks that will really be a great place to sort of key off from, to kind of help, hopefully, find ways how they get past the challenge that I've described.
Yeah, I'm excited for that as well, because I feel like I understand the feeling you're referring to, right? Where this person has likely used this metaphor for that situation for themselves for some time now, because it's what makes sense to them.
Yep.
But they likely haven't pushed beyond as to why they're using that metaphor or what it all means. But having you as a non-judgmental coach to inquire a bit beyond that, to scratch a bit below the surface, to cause them to pause and go, never really thought about that before. And without you giving them, possible reasons or answers, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure that, over these next couple of weeks that the brain will continue to process and maybe start to unearth a lot of stuff now with this newfound perspective on this metaphor that they had been previously using. So yeah, that sounds just about perfect to me too. That's a pretty cool feeling. I don't know how else you put it into words, but I feel like I understand what you're referring to. And I would again suggest, back to your earlier comment, that person wouldn't have gotten there with anybody else, certainly not at this point in time. So there. So take that.
It's funny. Thank you. It's funny you say that though, because it's like, has it really taken this long for me to get to that point? Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. You just continue to be hard on yourself, so long as you continue to serve your clients as powerfully as you do. Right? That's fine.
Actually, this is super helpful, because I talk all the time to clients about that, like their inner critic, and here I am, like, wow, that's really interesting.
So you can relate, you're saying.
Yeah. Well, I'm almost unaware of it. It's just describing it and like hearing it back, going, well, wait a minute, are you claiming a bit too much for yourself there, really? And
well, you're in luck, because we're recording this. You can listen back as many times as you feel like you need to. Well, that again, I think it does sound just about perfect. Who is someone you admire, and what do you admire about them?
I find it's a really hard question to answer, actually. I mean, I've got a couple of different people in mind, but I think one of the things I would say is I read a lot of history, and I always think it's like super dangerous to almost kind of create icons of people, because I think we all have flaws, and apparently my inner critic is busy telling me about mine right now. But if there is one person who I go back to when I'm reading history, it's probably Abraham Lincoln. And there's something quite, I think, brilliant about sort of his leadership. And if you haven't read the book, I think I've got the author right. I think it's Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote the book Team of Rivals, where essentially he surrounded himself in his cabinet with people who didn't share necessarily his views. I think in a couple of cases had run against him for office, and he managed to kind of coalesce them into really kind of a supportive and kind of a team that could work together really well. I think his ability to adapt in what must have been such a kind of a dark, dangerous period of America's history, and to kind of ultimately stand up for what is, what feels like is the right things to do, particularly in the age that we're in, where fortunately racial justice is a kind of a sort of headline, kind of mainstream topic. It feels like this was Lincoln represents for me sort of like trying to find the right way forward, in the circumstances that you're left with, in a really sort of decent, honest way, which certainly feels quite different to a lot of politicians that you ever read about and maybe experience.
Yeah, that sounds admirable, for sure. And I think it's interesting that you put it this way, that to caution not to create idols out of these characters, perhaps. But I think, I guess the reason I'm asking the way I'm asking is because I don't think you have to admire every aspect of somebody. You can pick and choose different attributes that you admire, and take from them what you will, and kind of create your own board of directors, if you will, right? Or your own roadmap of the things you admire and aspire to be. And certainly the narrative around Lincoln, some aspects more well-known than others, there are many things to aspire to be like, right? And certainly taking control in an era or a time when things feel out of control. I don't know, maybe we can relate to that pretty recently. How do you feel like you've taken that? You've alluded to it a few times, but I'm wondering now that we've brought up, President Lincoln, how you might connect with him in particular.
So I think the one area probably is like kind of an openness to ideas, because I think it's clear he certainly didn't enter office with the intent of making, outlawing slavery. But I do think kind of, obviously where he got to was that was the right thing to do. That was the solution to the situation that he found himself in. So I mean, a couple of takeaways from that. I mean, I think if you look back at kind of what other presidents, kind of both before him and after him, did, that didn't feel like the sort of the openness to. It felt like more dogma, and certainly, after he was killed, then a lot of awful things happened. It was almost a return to a de facto slavery after he was no longer president. So, but I think the big thing is that there's kind of willingness to adapt and look for solutions where I think others, like some of the presidents who followed him, stuck to a dogma and a set of beliefs that kind of, I think, essentially took the U.S. backwards in terms of its racial. Well, it did take the U.S. backwards in terms of kind of its racial politics. So
is it that he seems to have had been able to find the sweet spot between being principled but not overly rigid? Yeah, that's a much better summary than my kind of meandering thought process. Yeah. Well, you took me there, so thank you for leading me. I'm just trying to make sense of it. Yeah. That sounds. Yeah. Sounds like my friend Paul, actually. Not overly dogmatic unless it comes to his football team, but we'll give him a pass on that. I do aspire, I admire certain aspects to my friend Paul. Thank you. Although I should share with you just briefly, my daughter, I was sharing with somebody last night that, I make big issues out of some things that really shouldn't be big issues. And my 15-year-old said, "Oh, yes, he does." So that's good. Some instant validation. Right. So what do you imagine some people admire about you? So I think I know this because I've asked people. I think generally, particularly clients, think that I listen well.
And it's interesting, right? Because usually when you're doing coaching, you don't always do a lot of talking. I think what that's done for me and over the last 10 years is I am much more likely to listen in conversations that I'm in now than I would ever have done 10 years ago. I'm able, and I don't think this is necessarily a conscious thing, but I think I'm able to pick up on things that maybe aren't always said, but are implied by what people say, and kind of I find it relatively easy to make links between people talking about two different things, finding ways to kind of link those things together and make sense of them.
Making the connection points.
Yeah. And I'm cheating a bit about that because in my StrengthsFinder profile, connectedness is number one, which is described as sees connections between things. But when I saw that, it made so much sense. And actually, kind of probably seeing the StrengthsFinder gave me permission to be like, oh, I may do that a little better than some people.
I'm going to challenge your answer. May I do so?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It sounds like this is something that you admire about you.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So the listening is definitely, someone has told me that. I don't own that in the same way. But the connectedness, it's like, yeah, I know I definitely do that. The thing that I now recognize is I may do it kind of better than a lot of other people.
Yeah, you do. Yep. Yeah. And I think that is something to be proud of for sure. Yeah. But the reason I challenged is because that wasn't my question. I think that's great. I do believe, again, that's something to be proud of and something that benefits people, certainly.
Yeah.
Especially when they're bringing to you their raw ideas and considerations and things perhaps that they haven't thought fully through before, right? And one of the benefits they get from working with you is you have the ability to connect things for them and to get them to see things in different ways that perhaps they hadn't seen before or hadn't seen as being connected.
Yeah.
So again, sounds wonderful. But back to the beginning of your comment, you had answered saying, people have told me, and it sounds like it was more about the listening piece.
Yeah. And I'd link those together because I connect everything, right? But I think why people would say listening is because I will pick up on things that people have said and kind of play them back in a way that ideas get connected. And what they are experiencing is, oh, you heard me when I said X. Whereas the process, which I did, but it's actually the thing that probably they're noticing is that not only did I play back what they said, but it's kind of played back with this kind of twist and connection to other things they may have said.
Absolutely. Right. So the thing that they do admire you for is the listening piece.
Yeah.
But the part that you see most out of, because you are listening so well, and they're appreciating the aspect, but because you're doing that, you are then able to more effectively create these connections for them.
Yeah.
Which is something that you feel good about, because likely you've heard, oh, I'm a good listener. Well, thanks. But really what I'm proud of is being able to connect and bring some clarity to the situation.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
I admire that. I admire that about you, Paul.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't admire your listening at all. I admire your ability to make connections.
Which is founded on my listening.
Well, this is great. What other thoughts or questions do you have about intentionality or anything that we've kind of talked about thus far?
We've talked about this before. I think generally that coaching is in the way that I think we understand it is undervalued in our culture. I think I don't know if you've had the experience of kind of talking to someone who coaches sports, who kind of has a hard time understanding what you do, because if you're not telling people what to do, what are you doing? Almost. So I do think there's when obviously the most highly paid people with a coaching title are typically people who coach sports. It sort of skews people's perspective. I definitely think there are people who it's better for us to work with than others. So I guess long-winded way of my question being, how do you really identify the people that you're best placed to work with?
Gosh, well, frankly, I think it's just from working with all types of people and then figuring out the relationships that don't work as well. And then noticing the aspects of working with people that light you up. And I know I'm speaking in generalities. I'm kind of doing that on purpose so that I don't, refer to anyone in particular. But I don't think you can know without doing, in a way. That's my short answer. I think, I've been coaching a little less than you have, but enough that I've kind of shifted my trajectory, as far as who I work with and what, and the lens through which I typically work with people. Now it's very much building an intentional life for themselves. Whereas previously, certainly out of the gates, it was, I'm a transitions coach, right? I work with anyone experiencing some major transition in life. And then as I'm working with all these different people, it's like, oh gosh, there's so many things we can call a transition. I better get a little more specific here. Yeah. The biggest takeaway for me is that it is, if I'm going to borrow an attribute from Abraham Lincoln, it's to remain agile, to be able to pivot, to be open to what's working well, into changing without being overly dogmatic. That's certainly something I hold on to, is not holding on to anything too tightly. But it's a great question. How would you answer that question for you as far as determining who you work with?
Yeah, it's funny you should mention transitions. I think that was on my first business card. And I think my conclusion was that actually people who are really in a transition often don't self-identify well. At the beginning, I have a lot of people would say, I know someone who needs your help. And it's like, seldom did, I'm guessing, the person they thought needed help think they needed help.
100%, 100%, right.
I think one of the things that I have definitely learned is that I work better with people who probably share something in common with me, whether that be kind of personality, whether that be interest in ideas. Like there's quite I've got a huge vinyl music collection, which if we were doing this on video, you could probably see part of in the background. I've worked with a bunch of people who share my interest in music. Probably about a third of the blogs that I do on my websites are about that. And at the beginning it seemed a bit weird, but then it kind of I had this realization that there were a lot of the things that connected me to people were things like music, things like ideas. So I have a couple of clients who were often trading book recommendations, for example. There's almost a foundation to the kind of relationship there, sort of, aside from kind of whatever else they want to work on.
Is that how you choose? Do you factor that into who you choose to work with?
No, not really. No. I think it just seems to. So if I look at the people I work with long term, there's usually one or other attributes that kind of they're interested in that I'm interested in too.
Yeah.
Which I'm telling you this, recognizing that I don't see anyone else describing kind of their niche in this way. Like I work with people who like music, just like what doesn't sort of seem to make sense. But it does seem that the most enduring relationships and people that kind of want to come back and work with me, and I guess there is some sense of you kind of if you can identify with someone that you're kind of sharing your innermost thoughts with. Then, I think feeling some sense of confidence that this is someone who at least has something in common with you.
It sounds like it's getting at the idea of relatability.
Yeah. And it's definitely, it's independent of gender or race.
Mm-hmm.
But there's definitely some common thing, which is kind of more than, we live in the same neighborhood or, we go to the same events.
Yeah. All right. I'm gonna challenge you on this one. Are you ready?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Who do you not work with?
I not work with. So this is a lot easier to answer like 4 or 5 years ago, because I was working with a lot of people who were doing corporate stuff, and I didn't necessarily share the passion that they had for their own goals. As kind of time's gone on, I feel like I don't come across a lot of people to be coached who I'm not able to kind of have kind of some kind of relationship with. I think a lot of that's about experience, right? I think at the beginning, then I was kind of happy to take almost anyone on, and now I'm not even looking for some of the people that I may have had challenges with in the past. There was someone I actually stopped coaching probably like 5 years ago because it absolutely wasn't working for them, wasn't working for me. And the essence of the problem was that their challenge was other people didn't think they were as brilliant as they thought they were. And now it's like, I could spot that. I probably wouldn't have got to the point where I was trying to work with them and sort of realizing that it was not a solvable puzzle. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's
yeah.
So there's some wisdom and experience.
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously other kind of dimensions to who wouldn't I work with, but I don't. In terms of people's, I'm firmly on the page of kind of wanted to work with people who I guess have got who embrace equality and diversity. That's important to me. But I say that kind of almost knowing that I don't really come across people who wanted to be coached who don't kind of embrace those things.
Yeah, I think the most challenges I've had in coaching is when I realize that the person I'm coaching doesn't really want to be coached, either any longer or didn't want to begin with. And typically this has come up for me when I have a parent of an adult child, right? It's like, oh, I know someone. It's like, do you work with kids? Like, well, how old are we talking? Like, so for me, there's a certain set of parameters. To me, it's absolutely crucial that there's buy-in from the coachee, because early on, again, I was coaching, because I felt confident that I could coach anyone.
Yeah.
I still have that confidence, but I no longer want to coach anyone. And it was clear early on for this one client of this adult child, where the parent was the sponsor, if you will. The child was doing the things. They were becoming efficient, productive, members of society, if you will.
Yeah.
However, at the root of it, they were doing it for their parent. They weren't doing it for themselves. And as I surfaced that stopped the presses, if you will.
Oh, that makes it very hard. I had a similar experience of coaching somebody, and the sponsor was the person's manager, and it was really hard to make progress because what they were interested in was what gets reported back.
The external.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
I think I know we could spend a lot of time going down this, but perhaps in the interest of keeping this to a listenable nugget, a listenable episode, in a world where we don't typically give advice, do you have any advice for someone who's looking to live with some more intention in their lives?
I'm tempted to say no, right? Because that would be a really good coaching thing to do.
But I'm not asking you as a coach. I'm just asking you as the guy I'm talking to.
I also was looking for a quick laugh. So I think not as a coach, the thing that's influenced me most in the last 6 months is I read Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, which is a history of racism in the US. To say it was like eye-opening is just feels like a bit too kind of cliched, but there was so much stuff in that book that I was not aware of, and kind of made me think that this should be the kind of book that's compulsory reading for kind of high school students this country. So I guess my advice is not as a coach, just as a kind of a person living in the United States in 2021, is if you haven't read Stamped from the Beginning, and there are probably other books which are equally good at telling the story, but it's just an unbelievably difficult at times and kind of tragic story of kind of all of these like missteps, and some of them intentional, that have happened, and kind of one of the reasons why I think the aim of racial justice is so important to the country's future. I'm not sure if that's what you're looking for, but that would be my thing that people should do, my bit of advice.
I like it. I'm gonna take you up on that advice. So there's at least one person who's going to actively listen to your recommendation there.
So that's doubled the number now, because I actually gave my copy of the book to somebody last week because they had expressed an interest after my recommending it. So good, excellent.
The growth is out of control. That's wonderful. Well, Paul, I want to thank you again for your time this morning. This is great. I always enjoy connecting with you, but in particular over these topics as well. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on again. Thanks, Joe.
This has been Intentionally Ever After, hosted by intentional lifestyle coach Joe Bukartek. If you would like to have your own intentional conversation with Joe on or off the air, visit intentionallyeverafter.com. Thanks for listening.